The minute hand of the schoolroom clock was marking the half hour, and a subdued expectation became apparent in the group of outwardly studious girls who sat beneath it. More than one eye glanced furtively upward in expectation of the stroke. 12:30 was the signal for "recreation," during which, for 30 happy moments, Mrs. Usher's young ladies unbent from their intellectual labours, over milk, hard biscuit, and general conversation. The day was a warm one for late April. The morning had seemed long to everybody, and even Miss Parallax, the teacher of exact mathematics, was conscious of being glad when a jingle of glasses without announced that the refection was on its way upstairs, and relief was at hand. The single stroke sounded, and in a moment all was uproar. Desk lids were slammed, chairs noisily pushed back. The girls made a rush for the entry and returned with their tumblers and crackers to lunch in company. There was a buzz of voices broken by shrieks and exclamations. One girl only kept her seat, bent over a geometrical diagram. "Barry, Barberry, are you never going to stop?" demanded a tall, fair girl, coming up to her. "Do hurry and get your milk. It will all be gone if you don't. And, besides, I want to talk to you." "I was only finishing this equation. One does so hate to be beaten by a problem." "I can't think why you should. I don't. What on earth can it matter whether the square of CB equals D or not? The conundrum is not worth guessing. I never could see what was the use of higher mathematics anyway. Arithmetic, yes, that is useful, because of keeping your accounts. Not that I ever keep mine, but I know I ought. But who in real life ever did sit down to practice geometry? Come, now, Barry, you know no one ever did." "I dare say not." Barbara Allen, called Barberry for short, and Barry for shorter, according to school parlance, was easily first favourite among Mrs. Usher's 35 scholars. It was a "select" school, and numbered among its list of pupils certain well-known names. There were Kate Van Rensselaer from Burlington, and Kate Schuyler from Dobbs Ferry, and Kate Schermerhorn from New York, besides the 2 Biddle sisters from Philadelphia, and Ellen Sears from Boston. Good names, these. Names to figure well in a catalogue, and fill the heart of a schoolmistress with pardonable satisfaction. But still among these Kates, Biddles, Sears, and all, Barberry, with no special family backing, held the reigning place. They loved her for her sunny, sweet temper. They admired her for her girlish wit and cleverness. They raved over the soft curves of her face and throat, the colour of her eyes, the thickness of her wavy brown hair, the way in which she sat and moved and stood. Girls are almost as much influenced by pretty looks as boys are. But Barbara was not only pretty, and not only even so very pretty. Her gift was charm, and it goes farther than beauty with us all, and its effect lasts longer. Kate Van Rensselaer called Barbara the best bred girl in school, and Kate was very particular in such matters. Kate Schermerhorn said she had air and was stylish, that potent word in the mouth of a New Yorker. Yet Barbara's clothes were not elaborate or costly. She always had enough to get along with, but never any superfluity. The Biddles raved over her voice, a sweet, low voice, with deep bell tones in it, and refined intonations which were a heritage from a Virginia grandmother whom she never saw. Truth to say, the Biddles, nice girls as they were, had something odd the matter with their vocal organs, the result of a civic environment perhaps, certain sharp A's and imperfectly rendered O's, which sounded strangely to unaccustomed ears. Ellen Sears dropped her terminal G's till they lay about, thick as leaves in Vallombrosa. Barberry, as her friend Mildred Grant declared, was the only girl who said, "Don't you?" properly. All the others pronounced it, "Don't you?" These little delicacies and refinements of speech seemed to be born with her, and to come naturally. No one exactly knew why. For, as Kate Van Rensselaer remarked, she was more like Melchizedek than it was natural a girl should be, having neither father nor mother, nor end of days, nor any relations in particular, except an old grandfather and grandmother, of whom little was known, beyond the fact that they lived somewhere in Massachusetts and paid for her schooling. "But you can be sure they are gentlefolks just by looking at Barberry," went on this discriminating critic. "She has good blood in her veins. You can always tell." Barbara had never said much to her schoolfellows about these grandparents of hers. It was not that she was ashamed of them, but they and their old-fashioned ways and unprosperous lives seemed set so far away from the experiences of her careless, happy, modern companions that it was not easy to explain about them. She had no remembrance of her mother, who had died when she was born, or of the brave soldier father who had followed her so soon, losing his life, to find it again, on the red field of Gettysburg. Her first recollection was of the old road-house at Quasset 5 Corners, of which, for 40 years, her grandfather, Squire Allen, had been landlord and proprietor. To keep an inn in the past days of stages, when railroads were few and far between, and were regarded as dangerous innovations and novelties by many sober-minded people, was both remunerative and highly respectable. It was different now. Barbara loved the old place and the old people who lived in it dearly, but she could see that to outsiders the situation would seem queer and impossible. She had no false shames, no paltry timidities. Had there been any reason for it, she would have bravely announced it to the whole school, or the whole world, that her grandfather, who was the dearest old man she knew, kept a tavern and had done so most of his life. But there seemed no reason. The girls loved and accepted her for her own sake. No one questioned or apparently cared. They would all love Grandpa if they knew him, reflected Barry, and they would understand just how it is if they could only see the old home and grandmamma. But it would be very hard to make them understand without seeing it. It all seems very far away, here. And, after all, it is not myself, and there is no use in speaking unless someone should ask. Then I would tell them all about it. But so far no one had asked. The belle of the school sat perched on her desk, eating her biscuit, and a half-dozen girls gathered around to talk to her. It was invariably so at recess. Barry was always the center of a group. "Finish the story of Muley al-Hassan," said Kitty Schuyler. "There are 16 minutes left. You had just got to the point where he was arming himself to rush upon the foe." "The rest of it is rather gory. Wouldn't you rather that I began something else, a more pleasant story?" "No, you cruel Barberry Allen, we wouldn't. We want to learn the end of Muley." "Rightly named," murmured Mildred Grant. "He was as obstinate a mule, I mean more, as was ever made. Go on, Barry." One of Barbara's many gifts was a talent for storytelling. The least little tale seemed to gain charm and value from the way in which she phrased it. She possessed a natural talent as to where to amplify and where to contract, what to add and what to leave out. "Very well," she said, "you shall hear about Muley. But it is very sad." Then she began, while the girls sat as close to her as they could get. Muley al-Hassan went steadily on with his task. He knew that the foe far outnumbered his little force, that there was no hope, that they must either starve to death or perish overwhelmed in the thick of the attack, and he resolved to end worthily. He took as much pains in arming himself as though he was not about to die. Every buckle and armor clasp was firmly fastened. He set his helmet on his head and turned down the visor. As he fastened his sword belt, he half drew the blade from the scabbard and looked sadly upon it. Engraved on the shining steel was a line from the Koran. It was an amulet, meant to strengthen his aim and bring luck, but well he knew that no amulet could serve him now. At last, when all was ready, he mounted his black horse, ordered the gate to be opened, and with his faithful followers about him, dashed straight down the steep hill and into the midst of the Christian army. His sudden onslaught was like a vision of doom, for they had halted to rest. a number were dismounted and unarmed, and before they could collect themselves many were slaughtered. At least a score fell by the hand of Al Hassan himself. "My, how delightfully bluggy!" put in one of the listeners. "No irreverent remarks," said Barry, threatening the offender with her half-eaten biscuit. But what can 20 do against 1,000? In a few minutes all was over. One by one the Moors who followed the standard of Al Hassan were cut down. He himself was wounded in a dozen places. The foe pressed him fiercely. A lance was at his throat, and he was borne backwards from his horse. It was just then that suddenly, above the dust of the battle, appeared before his glazing eyes a radiant shape. It was Asrael, the angel of death, sent forth by Allah to receive the soul of the hero. His face was kind and beautiful, and in his hand he carried a wreath of shining leaves plucked from the tree of paradise. "Fear not, true believer, defender of the truth, but come to your reward," he said. The Christians could not understand the strange, wild look of rapture which came into Al Hassan's face as he slowly fell from his steed. "Surely he has seen some vision," they whispered among themselves, as they stood watching him die, "and it has, why," in a different tone, "what is that?" That was a stir among the girls in the entry. Someone came rapidly upstairs. Barbara caught her own name and "Where is she?" and looked expectantly toward the door as Mrs. Usher came quickly in. "Here I am," she called out. Then she saw that Mrs. Usher looked agitated and held in her hand a yellow envelope. A sudden thrill of apprehension swept over her. "Oh, what is it?" she demanded. "Is it for me, Mrs. Usher? Is anything wrong?" "Yes, Barbara, it is for you, and bad news, I am sorry to say. They want you to come home at once. Your grandfather is very ill." "Grandpapa!" cried Barbara, in a voice full of distress. "Oh, what will poor grandmamma do? Does it say that he is very ill, Mrs. Usher?" "Yes, dear, very. I fear there is no hope. You must hurry and put your things up for the 3:20 train." Then, as Barbara rushed off to her room, she turned and said in a low voice to the girls, "He is dead, but don't say anything to Barbara. It is best that she should learn it gradually." Then she too left the room. The girls looked at each other in silent dismay. "Oh, do you suppose she won't come back at all?" whispered Kate Schermerhorn, putting into words the apprehension which all of them felt. "That would be too dreadful," said MaryAnn Biddle. "I can't imagine this school without Barberry. How we shall miss her." "Miss her? I should think so," broke in Mildred, impetuously. "But one thing I know, which is that I shall not miss her long, for nothing would induce me to come back next term if she were not here." "Why on earth should that old grandfather select this particular time to die?" demanded Kate Van Rensselaer. "I do really think he might have waited a few months till Barry had finished her education." "Oh, Kate, how can you say such a thing? It sounds so unfeeling. None of us can choose our time to die. Poor Barry was so fond of him, and, oh dear, even now she doesn't know that he is dead. I am going to help her pack." There were only too many volunteers for this service. Many hands made light work, and Barbara's trunks were soon ready. She left nothing behind. Her schoolfellows noticed that. Down to the least trifle, everything was collected and folded, as if she was quite sure she should not come back, Kate Schermerhorn said bitterly to herself. The white-faced, silent girl who went so steadily on with her preparations seemed a different creature from the merry Barbara of yesterday. The girls looked at her wistfully and half afraid. It was only when she kissed them for good-bye that the old familiar Barbara seemed suddenly to come back. The unshed tears in her dark eyes, and the touch of her soft face made them all cry. They watched her drive away through a mist of weeping. It was not till they reached the station, just before the train started, that Mrs. Usher said gravely, "Barbara, my child, You must be prepared. I do not think that there is any hope that you will find your grandfather alive." "Oh, Mrs. Usher, don't say that. I won't think it is so bad till I must." But Barbara could not help thinking it. She thought of little else through the many hours of her journey. With her forehead pressed tight against the window pane, she watched the dreary spring landscape as they glided past ponds edged with broom sedge and bulrushes, hill slopes topped with leafless trees, stretches of sandy plain and rocky ledges, telegraph posts and endless lines of wire. There was scarcely a hint of the coming buds and green. All wore the hopeless aspect of winter. Afternoon deepened into dusk, dusk into darkness. All was black except the occasional flash from a distant window. It was like speeding through starless space, and the clank and revolution of the wheels seemed to utter one recurring phrase: "Grandpapa is going to die. Grandpapa is going to die," over and over again. Barbara closed her eyes, and would fain have shut her ears, but the sound rang on, nor could she cease from listening. It was 10:30 before the train reached the little Quasset station, the nearest railroad point to the old inn. There were still 10 miles to drive, but Mrs. Usher had telegraphed, and a carryall had been sent over to meet Barbara. She knew the man who drove it, but she could not command her voice to ask any questions. It was not till the slow, interminable drive over the dim country roads was over, and the dark outline of the house rose close at hand, all dark except for 2 lighted windows, one above and one below, that at last she managed to say, making a great effort, "Jim, tell me, is Grandpapa alive?" "No, Miss Barry, he ain't. He died at 9:30, before they sent the telegraph." "And Grandmamma?" "Well, I hain't seen her since. I suspicion she's not right well," replied Jim cautiously. Barbara asked no more. In fact, there was no time to ask, for the horse drew up at the door. She jumped out and went softly in. Someone came to meet her in the hall, a wrinkled old woman with white hair and a shrewd, kindly face. It was Hepsy Ann Green, who had lived always with Grandmamma and taken care of Barbara herself when she was a little girl. "Where's Grandmamma?" demanded Barbara in a whisper. "She's upstairs in her room. She hain't stirred since she was took. It's the Lord mercy it was up there it happened, and not down here. For how should we have got her up them narrer stairs and through the entry I don't know. She's heavy, and it seems to hurt her to move." "Took," said Barbara. "Is she ill, too? Oh, Hepsy, is everybody going to die? Jim just told me about Grandpapa." "It was some kind of a stroke. But I don't think the doctor considers her dangerous, only dull and stunned like. It came upon her very sudden, you see. Your grandpa was only sick 2 hours. There, there, honey dear, don't cry. You can run up and look at her if you're a mind to, but it won't be no comfort, for she don't seem to know anybody yet. I've got some supper in the dining room for you. Hadn't you better eat before you go up, and not come down again? It's nigh on to 12:30. But to this proposal Barbara would not listen. She ran upstairs and was gone some minutes. When she came down she was crying bitterly. "Oh, Hepsy," she sobbed, "she looks so changed. She never moved or knew me at all. I never saw Grandmamma before when she had not a smile on her face. No, she's past smiling any more, I doubt. There, there, don't feel so bad, child. It's the Lord's will, and we've got to put up with it, and not murmur, since it's so." She led the weary girl into the dining room, a big, bare place intended for many people, and looking dark, cold, and forlorn with its one table and single plate and cup. She soothed and petted Barbara and coaxed down a few mouthfuls, then took her upstairs, put her to bed, and tucked her in as though she were still a little child. Just say your prayers and try to sleep, honey dear, she said as she withdrew with the candle. You'll need all your strength for what's coming tomorrow. I feel as though I should never sleep again, sighed Barbara. But she was too young and too tired to lay awake. Before long the merciful oblivion of slumber came to her, and all sorrows and fears dropped away and were forgotten. When she roused to the sense of a new day, the sun was pouring in broad yellow beams through a broken slat in her blind. It was some seconds before she recollected where she was, and how she came to be there. It was a long, hard day that followed. Nor was the next any easier. Mrs. Allen, roused to partial consciousness, could not bear to have her granddaughter out of her sight for a moment. She clung to her with a sort of frightened energy, and only when she fell asleep could Barbara leave her to do the many things that needed to be done. The kind old doctor came and went. Hepsy turned to her for orders. There was the minister to see, and the undertaker. Barbara felt as if she were walking in a dream. To her carefree, happy girl life the abrupt intrusion of these responsibilities and cares was painfully confusing. Even the funeral of her grandfather seemed a dream. The rows of carryalls and wagons in the sheds beyond the meeting-house, the solemn assemblage of neighbours, the discourse which made her cry because there was so much in it about her grandfather's goodness and readiness to help and oblige people, the wailing cadence of China sung by the choir. There were a great many people present. Squire Allen had been one of the standbys of the small settlement. He belonged to the past as well as to the present, and people respected him as a good citizen and kind neighbor. As clear as the day and always to be depended on to do the square thing by everyone, folks said, though they added that it was a dreadful pity he hadn't a little more sense about business and had let things run down so. The faculty of getting and keeping money is that which is most admired in New England communities. Still, integrity and benevolence command a certain regard. It was over at last. Squire Allen was laid beside his first wife in the weedy little burying ground at the top of the hill, and the long line of vehicles wound slowly down the road again. Barbara went home, feeling little comforted by the services. There was a good deal more consolation in the touch of Hepsy's hands on her hair, and the kind voice which called her "honey dear," than in anything the minister had said. The squire wasn't only a professing Christian, he was a practical one, said the old servant, and the Lord don't make any mistakes about the difference between 'em. I hain't watched him all these years without knowing how it was. 'Tisn't so satisfactory to be getting older and poorer every day, as to make it worth while to stay away from heaven to enjoy it. I guess they're making it pleasanter for him up there than we could on earth, fix it the best we knew how. Almost no travellers stopped at the old road home in those days. The stage to Oxeter changed horses now at East Quassant, 2 miles farther on, and its passengers dined there. It was an innovation of 3 or 4 years' standing. Squire Allen had let the inn at the Corners run down, so that it was no longer comfortable, people said. The 3 or 4 casual wayfarers who halted for a meal during that first sad week were cared for by Hepsy. Barbara saw nothing of them. She remained with her grandmother, only going out now and then into the garden for a breath of fresh air. It seemed as if life were, perhaps, going to be always thus, always so sad and shaded and full of mechanically done duties, and she was too melancholy and listless to care very much whether it were so or not, and let day glide after day, careless whether it were morning or evening, and taking no pleasure in either. From this apathetic condition she was sharply roused. Just a week after her grandfather's funeral, Dr. Gregory, after his usual visit to the sick room, said with a grave look on his face, "Barbara, you and I have got to have a talk about matters and things. Something has got to be settled, and the sooner we get about it the better. Come down to the little parlour, and I'll send Hepsy up to sit with your grandmother." "I suppose you have never known much about your grandfather's affairs," said the doctor, seating himself by the table in the little parlour, which had once been the bar-room of the hotel, and motioning Barbara to a chair opposite. "Nothing at all," wonderingly. "Grandpapa never talked about such things to me." "I know he didn't, It would have been better if he had, much better. He was never a man to care for advice in his younger days, and of late years he grew touchy about being interfered with, as he called it. I hate to say it to you, Barbara, but it has left his affairs in a bad shape, a very bad shape indeed. They couldn't well be worse. I don't quite see how you and your grandmother are going to manage. Upon my word, I don't." He wiped his forehead nervously with his handkerchief. "Do you mean," asked Barbara, anxiously, "that there isn't enough left for us to live upon?" "That's precisely what I do mean." "Tell me exactly how things are," looking straight at him. She was a little pale, and what her schoolfellows termed Barbara's business look had come into her eyes, a clear, resolute, penetrating look, unusual in a girl's face. "I never noticed it before," observed the doctor, wiping his forehead again. "But there's quite a look of your great-uncle James about you. He was the lucky one of the Allen family, you know. Went out to China, made a fortune there, and died of cholera, leaving it all to the Board of Foreign Missions. Pity he didn't will some of it to the Squire. It's queer that I never observed the resemblance before, for it's really striking." "Go on," said Barbara, briefly. "Oh, yes. Well, to put the whole thing in a nutshell, your poor grandfather has left everything to go to rack and ruin of late years. He lost the stage custom, which was worth a good deal, by not keeping the stabling in proper shape, and the dinners ran down, and the drivers grumbled till the company lost patience and made the arrangement at East Crescent. Then he let the house get out of repair and shabby, so people didn't care to stop at it. It used to be a proper place. I can remember when 3 and 4 sleighing parties a week would come out from town for a dance and a hot supper. And in summer there were always city families staying here, off and on. It was quite a different place to what it is now." "I should think so, indeed. Go on, doctor." "Well, your grandfather seemed to lose all his ambition after that spell of fever he had 8 years ago. It aged him considerable, and he never was the same man again. Then, 3 years back, he endorsed Israel Saunders. There wasn't another soul at the Corners but would have had more sense than to do it. And that swept off nearly all he had saved. Things have just gone from bad to worse since then. When the estate is settled up, I'm afraid there won't be much left, except those bonds of yours. They're safe, I know, and the old home, and perhaps a few debts to call in. I'm not sure as to them." "Are there some bonds belonging to me? Couldn't grandmamma and I live on those?" "My dear, there are only 4 of them. The interest is $240. It isn't enough to keep you, and your grandmother is never going to be able to do anything again." "We might sell this place and take some little bit of a house. I wouldn't mind how small it was, if grandmamma could be comfortable." The old doctor shook his head. "I don't know who there is here who would want to buy the house as it stands. You see, it is not as if it were doing a paying business. And then, there's your grandmamma to be considered. I expect it would kill her to move. She's so attached to the old place. It's a hard sum to figure out, anyhow you put it." "Yes," said Barbara, slowly. "It's like a paradox. All the things we might do, we can't, and all the things we can't do, we ought to do. I must take time to think it over," she continued after a short pause. "I don't seem able to realize it yet. It is all so sudden. When are you coming again, doctor?" "Day after tomorrow." "Well, let me have till then, and please think, too. Perhaps you will hit on something." She went upstairs after the doctor left, to see if she was needed. Hepsy, sitting in the shaded window with her mending basket, made a sign for silence. Mrs. Allen had fallen asleep. Softly Barbara stole away. After a moment's hesitation she walked down the long upper entry and into the room at its end. It was a large room extending over the width of the house, with 2 windows at either end, and a 5th, in a sort of jog caused by the intrusion of a wing. The sun streamed in through the pensile boughs of a great weeping willow without, golden yellow with its mounting sap. "What a pleasant room," thought Barbara. "I don't remember this part of the house much. I wonder Grandmamma didn't choose it for her own." There was an old-fashioned bedstead in the room, but the tables and curtains had been removed, and the 4 bare post and unvalanced legs looked awkward and unsightly. Barbara studied the effect in silence and shook her head. Then she went softly down the entry examining each room in turn. An idea was forming in her brain, and she mentally took stock, as it were, of the aspect and contents of each chamber. There was not one pleasant one among them. All were small, some partitioned off from what had been the ball-room of the inn, others made from rooms originally large but divided in two by party walls, which brought fireplaces and windows into the wrong places. There were some good pieces of old furniture scattered here and there, but the mahogany was scratched and lustreless. A brass handle was missing now and again from the bureaus. The painted floors were dull and dusty. Everything was unattractive. Room after room. Barbara did not cease till she had inspected all. She made her way to the great cobwebby garret, in whose sloping corners every odd and end and disused scrap of the past 40 years seemed to have accumulated, and took a comprehensive survey of its contents. Then she ran downstairs and went over the ground floor with equal thoroughness. And lastly, she made a study of the outside of the house. It was a long, low building with wings, painted white, with a 2-storied piazza across the front, 3 windows on either side of the door below, and 7 in a row above. The door was framed in narrow windows, whose small panes made a geometrical pattern. At each corner of the house was a large square chimney, and the roof was surrounded with a railing, above which arched the boughs of 2 great elms which grew in front, and the equally ancient willow tree at the side. A long L at the back contained the kitchen and offices, and was separated by a paved court and pump from the row of stage stables, now empty and deserted. There was something pleasing to the eye in the old-fashioned buildings, but the prevailing look was of shabbiness. The dingy white paint had peeled off in places. Here and there a blind was missing or hung loose from a broken hinge. The latticed edges of the roof and piazza showed gaps. The gravel was weed-grown and the grass rough. Still, as Barbara noted the details, her face cleared a trifle. The idea in her mind was taking feasible shape. "We must stay here," she reflected. "Grandmamma can't be moved, the doctor says, and besides there is nowhere else to go. We cannot stay here unless we can persuade people to come and stop at the house. People won't come while the place looks as it does. Ergo, as Miss Parallax would say, it must be made to look differently. But how to do it? That is the problem." All that day and the next she pondered this question. Every moment that could be spared from the care of her grandmother she spent going over the house and making entries in a little notebook which she carried in her pocket. By the second day her plan was digested, and she felt ready for her interview with Dr. Gregory. He came looking as much puzzled and troubled as ever. It was evident that no kind fairy had dropped any suggestion on his pillow. "Well," he said briefly, "have you anything to say to me? I see by your face you have. You look more like your Uncle James than ever." This last as a parenthesis. "Yes, I've been thinking hard ever since you were here, and I have come to a conclusion, but I am afraid you will think I am crazy when you hear what it is." "I dare say I shall. Men of my age are apt to think girls of your age crazy. What's your conclusion? Out with it." "It sounds rather wild, but the only way I can see out of the difficulty is that I should put this house in order and try to get its custom back, so that it may support us." "Great Scott! That is a notion. Why, child, have you any sort of an idea what keeping such a house as this is like?" "Not much, I admit. I shall have to find it out for myself as I go along. But you don't quite catch my idea, Doctor. I don't want to keep the house in the old way, as Grandpapa used to keep it, I mean. I want to make it something a little different. There's a great craze just now for old-fashioned things, as you perhaps know. This house exactly lends itself to such effects, and if I could do it over in a quaint style and make it attractive, I think people might come out from town to stay here in the off-seasons, late fall and early spring, and midwinter, people who need a change and don't want to go far. It's real country here, for all it's so near the city, and it's very green and pretty, and the air is good. I seem to see just the set of people who would come if I once make it into a sort of fashion." "You're much too young to attempt such a thing." "But I shouldn't appear very often, you know. Hepsy would be the figurehead of the establishment. I can keep in the background and pull the wires. But when I did have to come forward, I'm not a bit afraid that I couldn't make myself respected. I can be pretty dignified when I choose, Doctor." She drew herself up as she spoke, and a colour flashed into her cheeks. "I believe you," said the old doctor slowly. "But all this would cost money, Barbie. Where is it to come from?" "That is true, and it is one of the chief difficulties," admitted Barbara, frankly. "But there are those 4 bonds of mine. I propose to use a part of them, the whole if necessary." "My dear child, those are all you have in the world. It would be very unwise to put them in a risky venture like this. Remember you are entirely inexperienced, and very likely to make a mess of the whole thing, and lose every cent you put in." "Of course there is a risk, but I don't think I shall make a mess of it. And if the plan succeeds, and the house pays, the money is much better invested so than where it is. We can't possibly live on the interest. You said so yourself." The doctor was silent. "Now," went on Barry, with a pretty tone of persuasion, "I really know a good deal about housekeeping, though you may not think it. I've been at school so much that you may naturally suppose that I have never had time to learn such things, but I always had a fancy for cooking and taking care of things, and grandmamma used to let me help her, and Hepsy taught me a great deal when I was little. Then last summer, when I was in Europe with Mrs. Usher, oh, dear grandpapa, think of his giving me such a treat, and he feeling so poor all the time." She stopped suddenly. Tears rushed to her eyes. "Yes, I know, said Dr. Gregory, patting her hand. "You were the apple of his eye, always, Barry. He'd have done anything for you. I know all about it, child." "Then there's all the more reason why I should do all I can for him now, for grandmamma, I mean. It's just the same thing," went on Barbara, impetuously. "And I'm glad he sent me to Europe, for, besides that I love him better for being so kind, it makes it all the easier now. I think I must have a thrifty turn, Doctor, like my great uncle James, you know. For all the while we were gone I was studying the way in which they manage hotels and pensions over there. It interested me, and I used to talk with the women at the bureau and ask questions and get recipes. I only did it to amuse myself, but I can see that it will be useful to me now to know about such things. Of course it's different over here, and we couldn't copy exactly, but you can't think how much more economical their ways are over there, and how everything is turned to account." "But who is to look after your grandma while you and Hepsy are carrying out this wild scheme of yours?" demanded Dr. Gregory, with an expiring effort at protest. "I thought of that, and it seems to me that Jane Jordan is the proper person. She's Hepsy's sister, you know, and her husband died in the winter. She used to live here before she was married, and grandmamma liked her full as well as she did Hepsy. I think she'd very soon get used to having her about. And Kitty Jordan, her daughter, will be just what I shall want for a little table girl. I could be training her while the alterations are going on, you know. Hepsy thinks Jane would come if she could bring Kitty with her." "What alterations are you thinking of?" "Not a great many. There are 4 partitions upstairs that ought to be knocked out. You see we should never have a great many people here at once. It isn't the sort of house for that. And the few who come will want large rooms with plenty of space and light. Little cramped ones, such as there are now, would be no use at all. See, Doctor, here is a plan that I made yesterday, taking away the partitions here, and here, and here," pointing with her pencil, "will give me 3 big rooms on each side of the entry, each with a fireplace, besides the large one behind. Then there are 2 more in each wing, not so big, but fairly good, and 4 little ones at the back, which will answer for the men servants and maids. The sort of people whom I want to have come to this house will all drive out from town in their carriages and bring their maids." "Bless my soul! And how do you propose to make these grandees drive out?" "By making the house so pleasant that they will want to come," replied Barbara, with a brave look in her eyes. Then here's a ground floor plan. I thought I should turn this room into a small private dining room. There's sure to be some one who objects to dining in company. And in the right wing I shall have 2 small private parlours. Then I shall make a larger private sitting room of the one that used to be grandmamma's, and that leaves the big parlour and general dining room for transients." "And where are you going to stow yourself away when all this is done?" "Oh, the housekeeper's room, in the left wing, would be mine, and I shall sleep in the small one opening from it. It is close to the kitchen, you see, and I should be on hand for emergencies. They are nice rooms, and I shall make them pretty. Trust me to look out for number 1, with a smile. It was the first time the doctor had seen her smile since her return, and he welcomed it as a symptom. It was as though the hard work she had prepared for herself had braced and refreshed her spirit. "I will think it over," he called back as he drove away. "Please think yes," she cried in return. "I'm not sure but she has hit on the only way out of the dilemma," he reflected as he jogged along. "What a capable creature she is, to be sure. Her great Uncle James over again, as I told her. Not one girl in 100 would have thought of such a plan, much less have felt capable of carrying it out. Poor child, she hasn't the least notion of what she's undertaking. That's the best of it. Folks don't know till they're well along in a job how bad it's going to be. If they did, they'd never try anything, I suppose, and then the world would come to a pretty pass. Well," with a groan, "I suppose I shall have to let her see what she can make of it. It's a bad business, and I feel as though I were conniving at a case of infanticide, but what else is there to do?" Barbara had her way. As Dr. Gregory had said, what else was there to do? The inevitable is an unanswerable argument, and matters were at such a dreary deadlock that any path out of the dilemma was acceptable. So he gave consent. 2 of the 4 bonds were sold, the money was deposited in the bank, and the improvements to the house were begun. There was a stir of excitement at Quasset Four Corners when it became known that little Barberry Allen was fixing up the tavern and intended to run it for customers as her grandfather had done. People said it was foolish for a chit of a girl to undertake such a job, that Dr. Gregory was a fool to permit it, and that it was sure to end in a general smash-up and foreordained failure. 1 or 2, who, perhaps, had private views of their own as to the ultimate disposition of the property by vendue or otherwise, prophesied even harsher things. But all were interested, and as the repairs went on quite a crowd, 6 or 8 were considered a crowd at Quasset, assembled daily, at such odd moments as their extensive leisure left a command, to watch the carpenters at work on the blinds and balustrades, or the painters as they covered the dingy clapboards with a coat of smooth buttermilk yellow, picked out with white, a combination chosen by Barbara because she had noticed it often on old colonial houses in northern New England. The blinds she ordered painted a deep green, because people who sleep late in the morning like their rooms dark, as she said. The trees were judiciously trimmed, the grass cut, and the drive rolled smooth and re-gravelled. The barns received the same care. Dr. Gregory protested against this as a useless expense, but Barbara persisted. "It makes the place tidier," she said. "And besides," coolly, "I shall want them in order when the stages come back." "The stages? Nonsense! You'll not get them back here, child. A thing that once flies off the handle like that never gets into shape again." But Barbara had the stables repaired and painted all the same. The reformation of the outside was easy enough. With the inside of the house Barbara's real difficulties began. So much needed to be done, and there was so little money to do with. For Barbara was resolved not to spend the whole of the little stock in reserve unless it were absolutely necessary. "I must at least leave enough to bury grandmamma and me decently if we starve to death during the experiment," she said to herself, half quizzically and half bitterly. Before buying anything, she and Hepsy devoted several days to a thorough examination of the contents of the big garret. It was a place that rewarded search. Nothing, apparently, had ever been thrown away in the old inn, however useless in appearance. It had been stored in the garret or the loft over the barn. All manner of unexpected treasures turned up in the course of this clearing out: the missing bureau handles, the broken claw feet of the high chests of drawers, fire dogs of many patterns and sizes, fireboards almost as quaint in design, the pulleys and weights of the tall 8-day clock for which a quarter of a century had been accumulating dust in the barn, the chintz furnishings of the old four-posters, warming pans, fire buckets, 2 spinning wheels for flax and a larger one for wool, all manner of odds and ends. Barbara was "handy" at tools as with many other things. She set up a private glue pot of her own, and hammer and brads, a little chisel and saw, and went about mending chair legs and settee backs, screwing on knobs and replacing broken hinges in quite a workmanlike manner. Or, if the job was too difficult for her powers, one of the good-natured carpenters at work on the place would often lend a hand, and make things strong and safe for her to finish at her leisure. She could oil and varnish and rub as well as they, and put a smooth coat of paint over a floor, and she never forgot, as they were but too apt to do, to lock the door of the room afterwards, so that the floor might dry without any one's stepping on the fresh paint, which was a point in her favour. One great find she made in the garret, which was a number of left-over rolls of the paper with which the hall had originally been hung. A delightful old landscape paper with tall imposing trees, and groups of shepherds and shepherdesses disporting themselves beneath, and cockatoos and birds of paradise flying above, in all shades of tea blue. Years before, in a fit of misguided zeal, Mr. Allen had pasted this over with a paper supposed to be of superior modern elegance, a green paper with red and gold lozenges which suggested caterpillars sprinkled at regular intervals over it. Ugly in itself, it was still uglier as conflicting with the characteristic of the house. When it was torn off, and the halls upstairs and down rehung with the old-time landscapes, the improvement was marvellous. Everything else seemed at once to fall into chord with it. The twisted balustrades of the white painted staircase, the tall clock restored to its place in the corner, the wooden settees which Barbara brought in from the barn loft, scraped, varnished, and set on either side of it, the row of leathern fire buckets, each with its date, which she hung on the landing, and the big wool wheel standing vis-à-vis to the clock. Barbara longed for some Eastern rugs to lay on the brown-stained polished floors, but these she could not afford. In their stead she put squares of the heaviest rag carpets she could find, bound or fringed, and lightly tacked to their places. These she could buy from her neighbours. They made rag carpets still on some of the outlying farms near Quasset, and the general mix of colours and absence of pattern seemed to suit the effect which she wished to produce better than a modern Kidderminster or Brussels. Out of the garret, which seemed to possess the useful quantities of that wondrous bag carried by the old mother of the Swiss Family Robinson, came 2 heavy coverlets, needle-worked and thick as carpet, which did duty as portieres over the dining-room door and parlour doors. She also found a whole trunkful of dimity curtains and counterpanes edged with ball fringe, which were the very things for the bedrooms, and another of delightful patchwork counterpanes, upon whose squares of India cotton appeared birds and flowers of subdued but brilliant hues. It was not till every corner was ransacked, and every scrap of old material turned to account, that Barbara began to buy. Then she went to Boston for 2 long days' shopping, with a firm determination in her heart that whatever she got should be pretty, odd, and a bargain, or she would not buy at all. A few years since such a quest would have been hopeless. Nowadays it is comparatively easy. Many modern stuffs have a flavour of the antique about them, and the cheaper things are often as pretty in their ways as the dearer ones. Barbara had no difficulty in finding papers which suited her purpose, at 15 and 20 cents a roll, good and unobtrusive in design and of refined colours, soft tones of yellow and olive and blue. There were curtain materials in plenty, thick and thin, which cost little, and cheap chintzes resembling the old patch in effect, to suit her antique chairs and sofas. A little hunt in the bargain shops revealed stores of delightful tumblers and goblets, knobbed or grooved, in spiral circles, which looked old enough to suit the days of King Arthur, and cost but 9 pence apiece. Pretty dishes, also equally inexpensive, brown glass which looked like cut glass, and deep-hued Japanese wares at the price of common white. A store of these did Barbara lay in, with a sense of wonderment at her own good fortune in finding them. "It seems impossible that I can have got so much for so little," she said, counting over her money, and looking at the long range of articles which she had just unpacked. "See, Hepsy, these charming little blue pitchers only cost 15 cents apiece, and the plates 18. And just look at my flower jars. I want always to have a great many old-fashioned flowers about the house, and those 11 vases, all different and all pretty, only cost me $4.50. You and I must fly to work on the pincushions and the curtains now, and then we shall be ready to begin." One discovery made in the attic was of the old sign which had hung above the door of the inn half a century ago, and had been taken down when Grandpapa entered into possession. "The bush" was the legend it bore in faded letters of blue and gold on a white ground, and the pole by which it was affixed to the piazza still survived. This sign Barbara herself retouched. She painted a thick wreath of barberries around the edge, and after some consideration added one word to the inscription, making it run thus: "The Barberry Bush." This was in part because of the play on her own name, and partly because of the added quaintness of the title. This done, there only remained to compose an advertisement which should correspond with the title and aspect of the place. It appeared about the middle of June in the Boston papers, and was as follows: "The old roadside inn at Quasset Four Corners, having been put into complete repair and refurnished, is now ready to receive lodgers. For information and terms address B. Allen, The Barberry Bush, Quasset Four Corners, Massachusetts." For 7 weeks this carefully worded appeal appeared day after day in the morning issue of the Herald, Globe, Post, and Advertiser, and nothing whatever came of it. The custom of the house was still limited to the half-dozen wayfarers on foot or wheels who, between Sunday and Sunday, stopped for a single meal and went their way. Occasionally one of them said something complimentary about the dinner or the improved looks of the place, but fine words butter no parsnips, and the young landlady needed more substantial approval. In vain she reminded herself that the Barberry Bush had opened too late for the spring and early summer chances, that everybody had left or was leaving town just as she began to advertise. Everybody at all likely to patronize her, that is. In vain she repeated the old saying about Rome not having been built in a day. She could not keep at times from feeling very downhearted. It was trying to have worked so hard and see no result, to sit idle-handed while she would fain have been busy. There was this added perplexity also, that while any day might bring a call which would tax all her resources, such a call could not be foreseen or counted upon. In the state in which her finances were, she could by no means afford to stock her larder with perishable eatables on an uncertainty, and yet there was almost as great a risk in being caught unprovided by a large party, and having her reputation suffer in consequence. Her neighbours hinted discouraging things. Dr. Gregory began to look sober and shake his head when he spoke of the future. Only Hepsy kept up her spirits. "The Lord ain't so inattentive to things as some people seem to think," she said oracularly. "And He knows you've done your best. You just wait and see how it turns out, honey dear." Barbara listened to these heartening comments and waited. There was in fact nothing else to do, but it was with a sinking heart at times that she did so. Taught by an inborn sagacity, she kept her resources well in hand for a possible emergency, laid in a few cans of the best imported soups, and took pains with her vegetable garden. She was careful to be provided with bread, butter, and milk of the best quality, and bought a coop full of spring chickens and set them to scratching in the disused corner behind the barns till they should be wanted. "I feel easier in my mind, now that those nice little broilers, as Hepsy calls them, are on the premises within reach of a sudden call," she told Dr. Gregory, "and I need not lie awake wondering what I should do if a carriage load arrived after the meat man has gone by for the day. It is really very nervous work, never to know if I am to have a dozen people for dinner or none at all. But the worst of it is that it is almost always none at all." The house was kept in nice order, trim, spotless, and fragrant with freshly cut flowers. These cost nothing. Squire Allen had dearly loved his garden, and Barbara found a store of the old-fashioned sorts ready to her hand: pinks, larkspurs, foxgloves and phlox, climbing roses and white lilies, lavender, sweet williams, and self-sown hollyhocks. She could afford to be lavish with them, and she was. If only some one would but come to see how pretty they looked. She was in a mood of unusual discouragement one morning in early August, as she stood in the garden surveying her vegetable beds. "This lettuce which you planted so late is just in perfection," she said to Hepsy. "The tomatoes are getting ripe too. Oh, dear me, I wish somebody would come and eat them." We are frequently unconscious of the inaudible footsteps of fate even as they near us. Someone was coming at that very moment, as Barbara stood pensively regarding her lettuce, and throwing a word now and then over her shoulder at Hepsy, who sat on the step of the side door shelling a mess of young peas which she had just gathered. This somebody was a brown young fellow in knickerbockers and flannel shirt, with a knapsack over his shoulder and a tennis cap set on a closely cropped head. He was to outward appearance very like other travellers who had come and gone, leaving no visible results behind them. Barbara barely turned her head as he passed up the walk, and never dreamed that, as far as her fortunes were concerned, he represented the turning of the tide. But all the same, though she little suspected it, under that tennis cap, and within that somewhat rough, tramping gait, lay the making of her future and that of the Barberry bush. "Whew!" whistled Sidney Owenson, as he stared at the renovated front of the building. "The rookery is all done over, I declare, and, upon my word, very well done, too. Somebody with taste has been at work here. That old sign now, I never noticed it before. The Barberry bush. Now I wonder who chose that name for it. It's awfully fetching, and so is that wreath of barberries. I should never have known the place." He crossed the piazza to the door, the upper half of which stood invitingly open, and gave another long, low whistle. "By Jove!" he said aloud. "It's an old-fashioned picture. I don't know when I have seen anything so pretty." Before him lay the broad hall, all in soft shadow, against which the gilt figures on the clock dial and the brass handles of a tall mahogany chest of drawers made glinting lights. On the table stood a great bow-pot of sweet williams, crimson, pink, and white, and a breath of mignonette came through the open door of the parlour on the right, a cool, inviting room, as he could see, with a pale olive paper and white curtains which waved slightly as the summer wind blew through the closed blinds. Sidney noted these things rapidly as he stood gazing across the door. Then he lifted the iron knocker and gave a resounding rap. The opposite door opened, and an elderly woman appeared, staid and respectable, in a white apron. "Will you please to walk in, sir?" she said. She did not drop a curtsy, as an Englishwoman under the same circumstances would have done, but there was courtesy in the tone and manner. "Thanks," said Sidney Owenson, politely, doffing his cap. "Could I have some dinner here, do you think? This old house is a good deal changed since I was here last, about a year ago." "Yes, sir, a great deal has been done to it. Will you wish to have a room, sir? Dinner will be ready at about 1:30, if that suits you." "Thanks, it suits me very well. Yes, I think I will go up and have a wash," said Sidney, vaguely curious to see more of the house. "I suppose you haven't many people stopping here just now?" "No, sir, not many. This way, please." "Who keeps the inn now?" asked Mr. Owenson, as they went up the stairs. "Old Allen, who used to be here, is dead, isn't he?" "Yes, sir. He died last spring. Miss Allen keeps it now." She showed him into the large room with the chintz-hung four-poster, closed the door on him, and ran rapidly down the back stairs to Barbara, who was still ruefully hovering over her vegetables. "Miss Barry," she cried, "you and me has got to take pains with dinner to-day. It's sort of borne in on me that this young feller is the kind you've been looking for all this time. He's a city chap, that you can see in a minute, but he's sort of different from them that has been coming, and he might say a word for the house." "And by George," Sidney Owenson told his mother the next day, "I have seldom been so surprised as I was by that dinner. I ought to have had my mind prepared by the way the rooms looked, but somehow one never does expect decent food or serving at that sort of a country place, and I expected, of course, to see the usual thing, with a little modification in the way of tidiness, perhaps. In the first place, they didn't ring a bell. A little maid in a cap knocked at the door with, 'Dinner is served, sir.' And when I went down, instead of the large bare table with a cloth across one end of it, which I was prepared for, there was a small round one, drawn up close to the window to catch the air, and nothing on it except a very white tablecloth, an artistically folded napkin with a roll inside it, and a little covered soup tureen. Oh, yes, there was a bowl of roses in the middle of the table, which smelled as if they were just picked, so fresh and summery. The soup was consommé, and if you'll believe it, there was grated Parmesan to eat with it. You could have knocked me down with a feather when I saw that. Then came a perfect broiled chicken, with peas and new potatoes, and a platter full of ice-cold tomatoes, wreathed with crisp lettuce, and seasoned exactly right with oil and tarragon. After that, a plateful of broiled mushrooms on toast, and to wind up, iced cantaloupe, and 3 great sweet apples baked to a jelly, with thick cream to pour over them. I haven't had such a good dinner I don't know when. So few things, but each so good in its way. No pie, no mixed pickle bottles, no chow-chow or tomato catsup, no bird baths full of cold vegetables, no flies. I felt as if I were dining in a dream. It was like the nicest sort of a little English country inn, only the food was 100 times better. And does the old woman you speak of keep the house and prepare these dainties herself? Asked Mrs. Owenson, entertained and surprised by the little story, which Sidney had purposely made as long as he could to amuse his mother. No, I think there is someone else. A Miss Allen, sister or daughter of the former landlord, but I didn't see her. The old woman seemed the person in charge. It is singular that a person in her position should have so much taste, remarked Mrs. Owenson thoughtfully. I'll tell you what, mother, went on Sidney, it wouldn't be half a bad plan for you to move out there for a few weeks. It's high ground at Quasset, you know, and cooler than this, and it's only 20 miles. I think you'd be comfortable, and it's better for you than staying in town. We could fix up a bed in the carriage, I am sure, in which you could make the journey without its hurting you. You know the doctor said last week that he should get you into the country as soon as it was possible. Yes, I know he did, but I thought then, and I think now, that it would be cold weather before I could bear the journey to Dublin. There's so many changes, you know. But to be lifted in the carriage and set down at this place of yours would be quite a different and much easier thing. It might be possible, and we will talk to Dr. Minot about it, if you really think I will be comfortable there, that is. I do think so, mother. If the doctor agrees, I'll write the old lady this evening. Mrs. Owenson had broken her leg in 3 places 2 months before, just as the summer hegira to their country place was imminent, and had perforce stayed in town through the warmth of June and the heat of July, cheered only by an occasional east wind and the attentions of her younger son, who came and went, but gave the greater part of his time to his mother, to whom he was devoted. The doctor, when consulted, approved of the plan. A letter was written and the arrangement was made. Barbara's chance had come. She was to receive Mrs. Owenson, her son, maid, nurse, companion, coachman, and horses, for a period of 2 months, at highly remunerative prices, and she felt that this good luck was probably but the beginning of still better things. 5 days later the Owens's carriage drove up at the door of the Barberry bush, just as the sun was setting. The drive had been a tedious one from the slow pace which it was necessary to observe. Mrs. Owenson was very tired, and rather disposed to repent her experiment, but as she leaned forward to look at the place, and saw the long, cream-coloured building under its shading elms, she gave a little exclamation of relief and pleasure. "It does look pleasant," she admitted. "It's because I'm so tired, probably, but I was beginning to feel sure that you had exaggerated things, Sidney. I see you haven't. Now, if you can once get me safely upstairs and into my bed, I think I shall like it." Hepsy was on the stoop, waiting to receive them. She handed Sidney a strip of carpet with strong handles sewed on either side, which resembled a legless camp-stool. "What is that?" he asked, surprised. "It's a kind of seat which Miss Allen thought would do to take the lady upstairs on. She saw one like it in a hospital, she says." This was really a clever notion of the old lady's, Mrs. Owenson remarked, as her son and the coachman carried her smoothly up the staircase. "A great deal better than being personally conducted by you alone, Sid, as I was when I came down. Oh, what a pleasant room!" It was the big room at the end of the hall, and it did indeed look pleasant. The many windows were all open to let in the fresh air, but a wood fire laid ready for lighting in the andirons of the Franklin stove showed that cold days had been thought of also. The end farthest from the bed was arranged as a little sitting room, with a lounge, easy chairs, and a low table. There were flowers on the chimney-piece and flowers on the dimity-topped bureaus. The sheets were invitingly turned down, and the curtains drawn far back for coolness. It looked most attractive. Mrs. Owenson was more and more charmed with every moment. "I declare," she said, sitting up on her pillows to drink her tea, English breakfast tea in a china cup with a dash of cream. "It's like a fairy tale. The White Cat or Beauty and the Beast. Only a white cat or an enchanted prince could serve such a nice supper in a wilderness like this. Look at that muffin, if you please. Sid, I hope there's one like that for your supper. What's under the cover? Tomato omelette, as I am alive! Now don't try to make me believe that there is not a fairy about the premises somewhere. Tomato omelette, at Quasset Four Corners. Sid, your old woman is bewitched. If you knew the right formula, you can disenchant her in a moment and turn her into a princess. In that case, I'm rather glad that I don't know the formula. I like her better as she is, said Sidney, pleased at his mother's pleasure. I don't believe there's a princess going who has such good ideas about cooking. Give me my old woman every time. Now, Mother, since you seem all right, I'm going downstairs to attend to my own appetite. I hope that old brick is going to give the rest of us something equally satisfactory for supper. It was not until several days later, when, as it chanced, Sidney had gone off for a brief visit with some friends, that Mrs. Owenson met Barbara. She wanted to arrange for a niece to come to her for a fortnight's visit, and demanded to see the landlady. Her eyes were on the door when Barbara tapped, and there was a distinct picture before her mind of the sort of person she expected to see. Tall, angular, neat, capable, a typical New England old maid of the superior type. Her surprise was great when, in answer to her "come in," there appeared a slender, upright girl, dressed in the simplest black, relieved only by a white collar and apron, with a sweet face lit by a pair of resolute brown eyes, and brown waving hair dressed to perfection. An unmistakable lady at every point. She carried 3 beautiful white Provence roses in her hand. "I hope you are feeling better this morning," she said simply and cordially. "Shall I put these into your vase? They are just from the garden, and very sweet." "My dear, I don't quite understand," said the surprised Mrs. Owenson. "You must excuse me, but I was expecting to see the landlady." "I am the landlady," said Barbara. "Hepsy said you wanted to speak to me." "You!" cried Mrs. Owenson, a world of astonishment in her voice. "But I was told that Miss Allen was an elderly person. Is she your aunt?" "No, I have no aunt. I am the only Miss Allen there is," replied Barry, unable to keep from smiling. "Please forgive me for being so young, and tell me what I can do for you. I am very anxious that you should be comfortable." "Oh, I am. I never was so comfortable out of my own house before in my life. It was only that I wanted to ask. But do you mean that you really keep this inn and arrange things so delightfully all by yourself? I thought there must be some one besides that old servant. No servant would be capable of it, or very few ladies, in fact. Do excuse me for being so curious, but how old are you, and how did you learn it all?" "I am 19, nearly 20, that is, and, indeed, I haven't learned it all. It is still a new work for me, and I hope to improve and do much better as I go on. You are my first lodgers, you know, and I trust you will let me know if there is anything you think should be changed. I have to learn, like all beginners, by my own mistakes, and criticism from people who know how such things should go would be a great help." "There's nothing to criticize that I can see. Everything is delightful," said Mrs. Owenson kindly. She felt wonderfully drawn to the pretty creature, younger than her own daughters, who had taken such a task on her shoulders. Mrs. Owenson's daughters were all married. She had grandchildren fast growing up, for all that she looked and felt so young. "Do sit down a little while if you can spare the time," she said persuadingly, "and please tell me a little bit about yourself, and how you came to be here keeping a house like this. Invalids have such a dull time that they are privileged to be inquisitive, you know, and I am sure that you have not spent all your life at Quasset Four Corners." Barbara sat down, and won by the gracious manner and kind eyes of her questioner, told frankly the little tale of her necessity, her disappointments, and her hopes. Mrs. Owenson listened with absorbed attention. "It's a romance in real life," she declared. "Somebody ought to write it out. Not one girl in 1,000 would ever have thought of such a plan, or been capable of carrying it out successfully as you have done." "Then you really think I shall succeed?" asked Barbara anxiously. "It would be such a relief to be sure of it. It means so much to us, and all the people about here have been certain that I should fail. Your coming was the first gleam of hope I have had. It takes so long to start a thing of this kind, and get people to notice it, and you see grandmamma and I cannot well afford to wait." "My dear, you will have plenty of people a little later. Don't be afraid as to that. It's exactly the position for a house of this kind, and you have made it all look so charming that there is no danger that you won't have customers. I shall be surprised if you don't find yourself the fashion yet. You are very wise, however, to put your old servant forward as a figurehead," she added, struck with a sudden thought. "It would never do to get yourself talked of as a pretty young landlady, and have people coming here on purpose to get a look at you." "It would not," replied Barbara, coolly. "But it will never happen, Mrs. Owenson. Hepsy receives people for me, and answers questions, except in a case like yours, when someone is ill. I must go now. Please let me know if you want anything." "She didn't quite like my saying that," reflected Mrs. Owenson, "but I'm still not sorry I said it. Such a young girl might easily make a mistake which could lead to unpleasant consequences. How pretty she looked with that little blush and dignified air! Wherever she got it, she's a thoroughbred little creature. I can't imagine how she came to be what she is, with such an ancestry and surroundings. Mrs. Usher's school. Let me see. Didn't some of Harriet Sears's girls go there? I must find out from them." Mrs. Owenson was that unusual thing, a woman of the world who still retained the freshness of her sympathies and the power of enthusiasm. She took strong likes and dislikes, and was frankly ready to laugh at the scrapes into which these occasionally led her. But they never hardened her sensibilities. Her sons teased her about her impulsiveness, and laughed at what they called her fancies, but they loved her only the better for them. They were part of the warp and woof of her nature. One of these fancies she now experienced for her young landlady, and it grew stronger after every interview. These interviews were always of Mrs. Owenson's seeking, and were procured with a difficulty which lent them value. She was lonely, she declared. She needed to be amused. Barbara must take time to sit with her now and then. It did her good, and she wished it so much. Thus she pleaded, and Barbara could not resist the plea. She grew very fond of Mrs. Owenson, who had a motherly quality about her, irresistible to a girl who had never known a mother, and had always longed for one. To talk with Mrs. Owenson was like opening a door, closed for many months back, into her bygone life, and though it revived some regret, it could not but be an enjoyment. She planned her work, and gave as many moments as she could spare to this new and delightfully exacting friend. But these were not many, for the house was pretty full now, and it taxed both her resources and Hepsy's to provide properly for such an influx of people. With Sidney's return, accompanied by a friend, and the arrival of his cousin, Miss Elliot, Barbara naturally withdrew again into the background. Mrs. Owenson did not actually need her company any longer, and though repeated messages came down begging for a visit, she was inexorable. Miss Barry was too busy to be spared just then, Hepsy would say. It was only when the others were driving or off for the day that Barbara allowed herself the treat of a talk with her friend, and she only laughed when reproached for her hard-heartedness. "I'm carrying out your advice," she said demurely. "It was good advice, and I mean to abide by it." "Hoist on my own petard," laughed Mrs. Owenson, half admiringly and half provoked. "You are a stubborn person, and if I didn't like you so much, I could find it in my heart to quarrel with you. I miss you dreadfully, Barry. You don't half know how much." "You have Miss Elliot now, and Mr. Owenson and Mr. Granger to keep you company, so you can't really need me. Really and truly, I will always come when they leave you alone, but for the rest of the time you must excuse me. I am very busy, and besides it is really better I should. You know you said so yourself." "I know I did. Well, stay as long as you can, now that you have come. I've grown so fond of you that I want you all the time. But you have a great deal to do, I know, and no doubt you are wise about it. I wish you didn't have to do all this, Barberry. It seems hard you shouldn't be enjoying yourself with the other girls of your age." "It does seem rather hard, on the days when things hitch, when Hepsy's rolls are not up to the mark, or Mr. Jones comes without anything in his wagon that quite suits me, and an awful fear that you will have nothing for your dinners sweeps across me. Then I do wish sometimes that I could be put back a year or two, and find myself at Mrs. Usher's, with nothing to do but study and enjoy myself. Then, on other days, when everything works smoothly, and my pudding turns out well, and my jelly gels, and Hepsy reports that every one liked the salad, why, then I think I am having a pretty good time on the whole." With a self-denial as difficult as it was judicious, Mrs. Owenson had refrained from telling her son the history of their young landlady. "It's better for Barbara herself not to be talked about," she reflected. "She'll emerge from this eclipse some day, like as not, and meanwhile it's best that she should keep in the background. Besides, there's no use in making a romance of the case. Young men are so easily affected by that sort of thing. Sid might lose his head, or tell his friends, and the story get out. I don't want any of their mothers blaming me." She was so much in the habit of sharing her impressions with her favourite son, however, that she found it hard to be discreet. And she was proportionately discomfited, therefore, when, a month after their arrival at the Barberry bush, Sidney came in one day with an unexpected question. "Mother, have you any idea who a girl can be whom I just saw now in the orchard of this house? I didn't know there were any young people stopping here." "What sort of a girl?" "Oh, a very pretty one, tall, with fine eyes, dressed in black, and a nice figure. Not a bang-up beauty, but mighty near being one." "Miss Allen, who keeps this house, is young. Perhaps it was she." "Oh, it couldn't be Miss Allen. This is a lady, I tell you. She has the sweetest voice I ever heard. I can't imagine who it is." "What were you doing, Sid, to happen to come across her and her voice?" "Well, I was strolling about with no evil intentions in particular, and I made my way past that bed of tall asparagus, which screens the vegetables, to a shady bit of an orchard, into which I had never been before. And presently this girl came along with a kitten in her arms, and a basket full of apples. She was talking to the kitten. That was the way I came to hear her voice. She didn't see me. I kept discreetly behind a tree." "Now, Sidney," said his mother, who had made up her mind rapidly while listening to his explanation, "I'm going to repose a confidence in you. All the time we have been here I have been keeping something back, because I thought it was best. But now I will tell you about it, and I think you will understand." Briefly and picturesquely she related Barbara's little history, her bringing up, the sharp changes in her fortunes brought about by her grandfather's death, and the brave struggle which for the present she was engaged in. It was quite an interesting story as she told it, and Sidney listened intent and wondering. "You see," she ended, "that unless you are discreet you could easily do this poor child a great deal of harm. A little careless talk about her and her affairs with your chums and college mates might bring her into a notice which would be embarrassing, and make it hard for her to continue in what she is doing. She's a noble little creature, whom all good people are bound to respect and help, and I am sure I can trust you to keep her secret, and not to gossip about her with other fellows. The situation is just unusual enough to set them all to peeping and popping about in her path, just from a mistaken idea of chivalry and romance. I should be awfully disappointed in you, Sid, if I thought you capable of doing such a thing, but I am sure you are not." "You may trust me, mother. Not a fellow among them shall hear her name from me," declared Sidney. He chuckled a little, as if amused by some inward reflection. "That's my dear boy," said Mrs. Owenson. "Of course I shall be civil to her myself, if we meet," added Sidney. "As you say, she is a person to be thoroughly respected." "Oh, certainly," said his mother. So, acting under this permission, Sidney was civil, very civil, when he and Barbara met, which somehow chanced rather often, and all went smoothly for the next month at the Barberry bush. It was a crisp, sparkling morning in mid-October. The Owensons had gone away the week before, and Barbara missed them so much that she had to keep very busy over accounts and winter preparations of all sorts to avoid low spirits. Sid had grown to be almost as much of a friend as his mother in her estimation, and he brought into her life something which his mother could not bring, the sympathy which youth gives to youth, dear, hopeful, and delightful. He had scrupulously observed his promise of never naming her name to the other fellows, so scrupulously, in fact, that it was suspicious. It seemed as though he found particular pleasure in keeping the secret to himself. Barbara had just recorded the result of a long column of figures at the bottom of her page, when Hepsy hurried in, brimful of an exciting piece of news. "What do you think, honey dear?" she began, in a tone which was decidedly not sympathetic. "There's been a big fire over to East Quosit, and them stage stables is all burnt out. The hotel caught, too, but the engine got over there in time to put that out, and save the furniture. It was pretty badly burnt, though. Jed says it will have to be almost built over before they can use it. Mr. Harmon is all broke up, he says. You see, he was between two insurances. The old one run out last week, and he was going to see about a new one this week, only he didn't have time." "Hepsy, you don't sound half sorry enough. I pity Mr. Harmon. It's hard luck." "Well, Miss Barry, I don't set up to be particularly sorry for those folks at East Quosit. I can't forget how they stole the stage away from us, and almost broke your grandfather's heart. You wasn't here then, and you don't know how bad he felt about it." The defection of the stage line from its accustomed halting place at the Corners had been a great loss to the old inn, and was so still. It was one of the few lines of the sort left in New England, and connecting, as it did, the railroad, 10 miles to the east, with a series of mill towns and villages higher up among the hills to the northwest, it still commanded a steady run of travel. 5, 6, 8 dinners a day count for a good deal in the prosperity of any inn, to say nothing of stabling and horse feed. The final breakdown of the roadhouse in Squire Allen's hands dated from the time when the stage company, influenced, as was believed, by the evil arts and persuasions of this same burnt-out Mr. Harmon, transferred their stopping place to East Quosit, and thereby incurred Hepsy's everlasting resentment. Barbara had always cherished a dream of getting the stages back, and her quick wit saw at once in Hepsy's news something that might be important for herself. "What will the stage people do now? Has Jed any idea?" she asked, trying to keep her face and voice free from excitement. "Nobody knows yet, though I know very well what they ought to do. They're mighty close-mouthed folks about their affairs, but there's one good thing. Jed is going over tomorrow with a load of hay for the barn at the depot, and he'll see John Bradley, and perhaps he'll say something. I don't think much of that Bradley man, though. It was all his doings that they changed over to East Quosit. If he hadn't found fault with our dinners, they'd never have thought of it." "It's natural that people should like good dinners," observed Barbara, temperately, "and I'm afraid Grandpapa grew rather careless about such things towards the last. Dr. Gregory says he did. Never mind, Hepsy. If they give us another try, we'll do better." 2 days later Hepsy brought further news. "Honey dear, it's so funny that I can't help laughing, but them stage folks, they are planning to surprise you. Jed, he heard John Bradley and Mr. Billings, that's the manager, a-talking, and Mr. Billings, he said he didn't see but that they must try the Corners again, till the East Quosit house was fixed up and the barns rebuilt. And that John, he made all sorts of objections, and Mr. Billings told him it was the only place, and he's heard things were better than they used to be, and the upshot was that John concluded to try it, provided it could be a sort of surprise. I don't want the house all slicked up till we've made the agreement, and then left to run down again, he says. I'll take my own time, and send no word, and see what they're like. If it's any kind of tavern, they'll have some kind of a dinner, and I'll see what sort of one it is before I commit myself. They didn't know Jed was near enough to hear." "But, Hepsy, this is important. I'm really obliged to Jed for giving us this warning. You see, we have no one in the house just now, and it might easily have happened that there was not dinner enough for them. What day are they coming? Did Jed hear?" "No, Miss Barry, that's the worst of it. John Bradley didn't name any day." "Well, it must be before long, because there's no other inn that is at all convenient for them." "That's true, Miss Barbara, and we'd better keep sort of ready all the time, I think." "We will. Now let us see. Mrs. Owenson says you make the best chowder in the world, Hepsy, and that nothing can equal your chicken pies. Suppose you make a beautiful big one at once. That will keep, and can be heated in half an hour, and I will get a fish every morning for a chowder, and we will have some apple quince tarts made, and one of those milky rice puddings, which can have an orange marmalade and soufflé top put on in 5 minutes. I have just thought of a contrivance by which we can secure 20 minutes' notice before we are surprised." The contrivance was nothing more nor less than a field-glass, inherited from a sailor great-uncle. Armed with this, Barbara each morning perched herself on the edge of the scuttle which topped the main building, just at the hour when the stage was presumably due at the parting of the crossroads, 10 miles away. The first day saw the horses' heads speeding toward East Quosit, but on the second, the shining blinkers swept the curve toward the corners, and Barbara ran down to give warning. "Hurry, Hepsy, they are coming." 20 minutes' notice is worth a good deal under such circumstances. The chicken pie and the tarts flew into the oven. The chowder, already prepared, was set bubbling by the time that John Bradley drew up his team before the door, and called, in a lordly way, "House! I say, house!" confident that there could have been no warning given, no possibility of fixing up a dinner and deceiving him into arrangements which he should afterward repent. Things were in a forward condition. At just the right interval, not too long and not too soon, Hepsy answered his call, and simultaneously a boy appeared to take the horses. "Are you the woman of the house?" demanded the sturdy driver, taking stock, rapidly, meanwhile, of the improved condition of the premises. "No, sir. Miss Allen owns it now. I'm the housekeeper." "Oh, the old man's daughter, is it?" "No, sir. His granddaughter." "Well, I hope you and she keep it better than the old squire used to. There's 5 passengers for dinner to-day. It's just for once," cautiously, "and give us your regular dinner, if you please. Can't wait for no extra cooking." Hepsy looked hard at the shrewd old fellow. She understood his tactics perfectly. "Yes, sir," she answered promptly. "It will be ready in half an hour." "All right. And you understand it's just for once. We don't want to make a regular arrangement anywheres. As yet. I think that's fixed pretty well," meditated the wily Jehu. "There can't be much of the outside of the cup platter business done in half an hour, so it'll be a fair sample this time, and as I find it, I'll go by it." How he found it may be surmised from the fact that, after topping off several helps of everything with a second plateful of the orange marmalade rice pudding, he boldly marched into the kitchen and demanded to see Miss Allen. "Deal with principles is my motto," he informed Hepsy. Barbara, who had rather expected this demand, was in her own sitting-room, with everything in perfectly nice order. I do not know on what principle she had put on her most becoming gown, but it was a judicious act. Many a business transaction between man and woman has turned upon the choice of a ribbon or the fit of a pair of gloves. She was very serious and businesslike with John Bradley, but at the same time courteous and pleasant. That important personage was taken much aback at finding her so young and well-favored, but he had a soft heart under his bluff manner, and a daughter at home not far from Barbara's age. She did not find him at all difficult to deal with, and before they parted a bargain was struck. The stage was to stop for dinner at the Barberry Bush for 2 months, on trial. After that, further arrangements might be made, or might not, according to circumstances. "If you can do better elsewhere than you can here, you will be quite right to change," remarked the young landlady, quietly. "But I don't think you can, Mr. Bradley. I am very anxious to keep your custom, and think, by taking pains, I can please you. You must tell me if anything needs to be altered, and I will do my best to make it all right." John's account of the interview to his employers was as follows. "I want no ways prepared to find such a young creetur keeping a tavern, but she's got a head on her shoulders, sir, I can tell you. Was you satisfied with your dinner, says she? I was that, says I. And mind you, Mr. Billins, it warn't no dinner fixed up for the occasion, for she couldn't have had the least idea we was coming. deluded John. "Very well," says she. "You can count on a dinner as good as that every time you do us the honour to dine at the Barberry Bush." Those were her very words. I never see a house so improved as it is, all done over ship-shape and as tight as a trivet. And she meant exactly what she said, Mr. Billings. I could tell that by the look in her eye. A pause. "I was sorry when I come home to take charge of things to find that we had lost your custom," says she. "My grandfather, my dear grandfather, I think that is what she called him, was old and failing toward the last, and I can understand that things may not have been quite as they ought to be. But now that I'm in this place, all that shall be changed. If you'll just mention when you're not suited, I'll see that it's made right, if the complaint's reasonable," says she. "She's a real lady, Mr. Billings, and has a pretty way with her, she has, and she knows how things ought to be. I don't often see folks that come to the house," she told me, "because I'm rather young for such a place, and my old housekeeper does better than I should. But of course I shall always see you, when it's necessary, Mr. Bradley, because I want to feel sure that you're suited. So it ended with my making an agreement for 2 months, and then, if Mr. Harmon's ready, we can move back if we like, or we can stay on at the Corners if we'd ruther. I hope it strikes you as the right thing to do, Mr. Billings." "It strikes me that your young woman with the pretty manners has had very much her own way with you in the matter," remarked the manager of the stage line, with a laugh. "However, if you're suited, I am. The Corners is every bit as handy for us as East Quasset, and if this Miss Allen gives you good dinners you can fix it any way you like, John. I'm satisfied." So the stage came back to Quasset Corners, and came to stay, for, by the time the 2 months' agreement was up, Barbara, partly by the excellence of her dinners and partly by her pleasant way, had so completely conquered and subjugated John Bradley that he would have resented and resisted any idea of removing back to East Quasset. He became one of the young landlady's firmest friends and upholders, and to the end of his days spoke of her as the sensiblest girl he had ever come into contact with. "She's got a head like a man, sir," he would asseverate, "and that's more than you can say of every man that comes along. And she is as kind as a woman ought to be, too, and knows how to manage and keep herself pretty. In fact, sir, she's a rarey avis, as the professors say." With the coming back of the stage a long reign of prosperity inaugurated itself at the Barberry Bush. With every month its custom increased and its reputation. Mrs. Owenson acted as an unpaid agent to advertise it among her Boston friends. People discovered how pleasant it was, and how near and convenient, and it became a little fashion to go there. People came who were tired or needed a short change. People came who had been ill, and people came for the fun of it. Party after party succeeded each other all that winter and spring. It proved a cold season, with an unusual amount of snow and sleighing, but Sidney Owenson organized more than one frolic among his friends, with an early supper and dance at the inn and a moonlight drive back to town. Barbara could hear the gay voices and laughter from the pantry where she stood, helping old Hepsy to wash the plates and glasses. Twice she was aware that her school friend, Ellen Sears, was of the party, but she made no sign, and Ellen never guessed she was near. These evenings, when people of her own age were making merry under her roof and she had no part in the pleasure, were the hardest she had to bear. And still shut away from the natural joys of youth, and to be so lonely and isolated and different, as Barbara told herself. Sidney Owenson, who always managed by hook or crook to get a word with her on these occasions, found her once stirring egg-nog over a spirit lamp, with her face stained with tears, and was much dampened in soul thereby. But the tears were soon dried, and Barbara was her resolute, helpful self again, ready for her daily task, and content so long as things went well. Just once she relaxed her determination to keep in the background and the shade, and she repented it afterward. It was during the second winter, when Sidney got up a sleighing carnival in masks and fancy dresses, matronized by one of his sisters, and persuaded Barry to put on one of her great-grandmother's gowns, with a little black mask and hood, and slip in among the company for one dance with him. No one guessed who she was, and the waltz with Sid was very nice, but the brief little taste of gaiety seemed to unsettle and disturb her, and she made firm resolutions against doing such a thing again. It was stealing a pleasure under false pretences, she said to herself. Those people would have been shocked had they known who it was, Mrs. Mallinson particularly. I hope they will never know, but nothing shall induce me to be so foolish again. Nothing. And nothing ever did. The third winter was a mild one, with almost no snow, but this mattered less, for the promoter of the sleighing frolics was absent. Sidney Owenson, under strong pressure of persuasion from his mother, was in Europe, gone for 2 years to finish his medical studies. It had not been easy to induce him to go. He had said a good deal about the projected course at the Johns Hopkins and the clinics at the Massachusetts General, and Mrs. Owenson had been vaguely conscious of something behind these arguments which made her uneasy. She was fond of Barbara, but she had begun to blame herself as the cause of a propinquity which might lead to a grave social mistake, and she was glad and relieved to have her favourite son away for a time. When his 2 years' course was nearly over, she went out herself for the summer. Then she persuaded Sidney to remain for a special course at Vienna, where she established herself also, so that it was well on in the 4th year before he came home. When he did, Barbara was no longer at Quasset Four Corners. All had gone prosperously there. The inn was fairly established in favour and fashion, and Barbara rarely had empty rooms to complain of. Gradually she added to her staff of assistants, so that less of the personal fatigue fell upon herself, and practice made all easier. Her neighbours respected her as successful, and she had won their liking by many friendly acts and services. The Barberry bush had grown remunerative. Not only did it pay its way, but a surplus remained at the year's end, which, acting under Dr. Gregory's directions, she invested judiciously in such a way that, at the close of the 5th year, she had far more than repaid herself the sum borrowed from her little capital. Dr. Gregory was very proud of her, and disposed to take most of the credit of the experiment as the result of his advice at the outset, and Barbara, though she knew better, smiled when he did so, and never contradicted him. It was a cheap pleasure, which she was quite willing that the kind little doctor should indulge in, to suppose himself the architect of her good fortune. Grandmamma has been comfortable all this time, and kept the home she was used to, and never missed anything, she reflected. That is the main thing. That is what I did it for. Oh, how glad I am that I did it, in spite of everything. How glad I am that I decided to keep the house. It was the only thing to do. At the end of the 5th year, Mrs. Allen died suddenly and painlessly. She had never fully recovered her consciousness after the shock of her husband's death, but she was serene and patient, easily amused as a child, and she always knew Barbara and had a smile for her as she came and went. Her death left a sad blank in the house, and seemed to remove the reason for continuing there. For her sake the burden had been assumed. Now the task was ended, and the burden seemed doubly heavy with the impulse of duty for ever taken from it. And, just then, as we say, forgetting that these just thens of which we speak are prepared for by a long series of small, unrecorded acts and efforts, an offer, alike magnificent and unexpected, came from the landlord of one of the great city hotels for the purchase of the Barberry bush. Its advance in popularity had attracted his attention. He had looked into the matter, and made up his mind that he could use the inn advantageously as a sort of country annex to his own establishment. He offered $20,000 for the place, with all its belongings, and Barbara, after talking the matter over with Dr. Gregory, made haste to cinch the bargain. For he might change his mind, she said, and then where would I be? Nobody else would ever give me so much, I am very sure, and, to tell the truth, doctor, I'm longing to get away. Since grandmamma died, I have felt hopelessly not at home in the house." "What will you do, now that you have enough to live on?" demanded the doctor. "I'm not quite sure, but I think something which you will consider absolutely foolish." "I don't believe it. You couldn't do anything absolutely foolish. You're too like your great Uncle James for that." "Well, he left all his money to the Board of Foreign Missions instead of to his relations. That seems to me pretty foolish, considering how much some of us have needed it since. But you asked me what I'm going to do. I have almost decided to go to Paris and stay a year, Doctor." "Great Scott! What for? Isn't America good enough for you?" "Yes, indeed, and too good. But I want a year's study and a year's change. I don't propose to sit idle all the rest of my life because I have a few hundred a year to live on. I shall want to go to work again presently, and, meantime, Paris is a reasonable place to be in, as I shall manage it, and I can get hold of all manner of things there which will be of use to me by and by." "Well, I suppose you know best what you want. If it were any other girl but you, I should call it a wild goose chase. But you have a head on your shoulders, and I've found that you generally come out right, whatever you do." "Thank you, Doctor. I consider that a great compliment." Barbara sailed for Havre only a week before the Owensons came home from their long wanderings. It was not many days before Sidney made time to "run out" to Quasset Corners. He returned perplexed and discomfited. "Mother," he demanded, "did you know that the Barberry bush had been sold, and that fellow at the Westmoreland was running it as an adjunct to his hotel?" "Why, yes, of course. Barbara wrote about it," said Mrs. Owenson, trying to speak naturally and unconsciously. "Why on earth didn't you mention it to me?" "Didn't I? Well, the letter came when we were in the hurry of leaving Paris, and, let me see, yes, you were away at Etretat with Arthur Norman at the time." "It seems curious that you should forget to speak of it. There was the voyage home, too. Plenty of time to talk over things. Why did she sell it? You can't think how differently the place looks. All the same things are there, but the soul is gone." "Old Mrs. Allen died, Anne." "Old Mrs. Allen dead? Why, mother, that's another thing you never mentioned. When did she die?" "It was all in the same letter, I think, Sid," replied Mrs. Owenson, somewhat nervously. "And, as I tell you, you were away. Mrs. Allen died in March, and I think it was last month that the house was sold, not many weeks ago, at all events." "And where did Barbara go? Where is she now?" "Halfway to Paris, I suppose. She sailed on the Champagne last Wednesday." "Are you in earnest? Paris? What should she go there for?" "I am not quite sure about her plans, but she means to study French, and qualify herself for some sort of work. She has enough to live on comfortably, for the inn brought a good price, she wrote me, and I hope she will do well, for she is really a very nice girl," ended Mrs. Owenson unguardedly. "Now, don't let us talk about her any more at present, for I want to settle with you about the Dublin plans. Are you going to spend the summer with me? I hope so." "The better part of it, I fancy," replied Sidney, looking kindly but quizzically at his mother's flushed face. "And, as you say, we won't talk any more about Barbara Allen at present." The subject was dropped, and Mrs. Owenson hoped it had passed from her son's mind. But when, the following spring, he suddenly announced that he must run over to Europe for 2 months' study of microscopy in an advanced branch, her apprehensions revived. Whether they were justified or not, does not belong rightfully to this story, which concerns only the 5 years' struggle of a brave little maiden under a hard urgency and her final success. But so much I may say, that there is in Boston now a Mrs. Sidney Owenson, whom people find particularly nice and attractive, but about whose history little seems known beyond the fact that she was an orphan, and Dr. Owenson married her in Paris. Her name, by an odd coincidence, is Barbara, and Mrs. Owenson, who seems very fond of her daughter-in-law, calls her Barry. Do you recollect an old childish game which we all used to play in our youth, where the little players with linked hands dance round and round the barberry bush, all but one left out, one who is kept outside the rest, till, At a given signal, they all sing, "Make a ring and draw her in, and kiss her when you get her in." And then her turn comes. Perhaps that was the way in which Sidney Owenson played his game, and disregarding fears and objections, his mother's anxieties and his sister's warnings, chose for himself a lonely little player who was not having her fair share of the fun, drew her in, and made her happy with the rest. If it were so, he showed his cleverness, for his Barbara is quite as good at the game as any one, and is made welcome by the other merrymakers, as a good player always will be, and to him, as for her, work and sport are both made lighter from the fact that they share them with one another.